Hi, good morning, good afternoon. I guess morning still, technically. I appreciate you all coming. I didn't realize everybody would be in the same room, so this is a pleasant surprise. So my name is Dixon Vuic, and I'm a history professor. I am not a nurse. I've never been in the Army or the military. I come to this as a historian who was interested in war and women initially, and those interests have grown and kind of expanded in lots of ways. I have a very long title, and I'm going to explain that to you very briefly, but I am the Lance Corporal Benjamin Whetstone Smith Professor of War, Conflict, and Society in 20th Century America. It takes up a couple lines on my business card. And I'm at TCU in Fort Worth. And the reason I have this long title is actually because of a TCU student who was from San Antonio. Go Frogs. Benjamin Schmidt was a TCU student who went to TCU for about a year and a half. And the story that I have understood is that he had a little bit of fun, but he might not have seen the inside of a classroom quite as often as he should have. And so he joined the Marine Corps. He surprised his parents and said, I'm going to join the Marine Corps. And he deployed a couple times to Afghanistan, the second time voluntarily. His unit got orders, and he said, I'm going to go with them. And the second time he deployed, he was killed in a friendly fire accident. And he was 24 years old, and before he deployed the second time, he had told his father that he wanted to finish out his enlistment, come back to TCU, finish his degree in history, and then go on and study and become a professor. And so in his memory, his dad and his family and a whole lot of people, including folks in San Antonio and the Spurs, donated a lot of money to create this position at TCU so that students can study war, conflict, and society together. So I've been there for 3 years, and it's really been sort of the greatest honor of my professional life to have this position. Like, I get to spend my days with students talking about war, conflict, society, why it matters that we talk about military history, why it matters that we talk about women's experiences in war, why we talk about gender and war. And so it's just a dream job, and I get to do really fun things in my classroom. And one of the things that we talk about are Army nurses in the Vietnam War, because that's how I got interested in all of this. I was an undergrad at Marshall University, and I had to do my senior thesis, and I was interested in Vietnam, and I was interested in women's history, and lo and behold, I realized there were all these women who went to Vietnam. There's your project. And so my first book actually started when I was an undergrad, and it changed a lot in the process. But that's where I got interested in this. And so along the way, I came to the ANCA convention in 2003 in San Antonio and did a whole lot of interviews for my project there. Marge Canfield I saw is on the list. I interviewed Marge at the convention, interviewed Betty Antila there, a whole lot of people. And so I actually I'm surprised to see everybody in the same room because I didn't actually leave my hotel room. Everybody just kept coming to my room, and I did interview after interview, but it was really a great time, and that's one of my really fond memories of doing the research for that book. And so it's nice to be back. I can't believe it's been 14 years. I'm really old, so the title of this comes from, if you saw the title, you're like, wait, the bright adventure of Army nursing in the Vietnam War? Like, something is amiss there. Bright adventure, Vietnam War, those two things don't really jive. But it comes from this recruiting brochure, which was printed by the Army Nurse Corps in 1969 and 1971. Anybody remember? Anybody sign up because of this cute young lady here on the front? She really made it seem like a good time, didn't she? But it's an odd, recruitment ads are always a little odd, right? They're trying to recruit, not actually give you the real picture of what nursing is going to be like. But that's where that comes from. And so what I want to do is kind of break down the talk into about 3 categories. This is the copy, or the picture of the book from which this comes. And the title itself also comes from a recruiting ad. This was the recruiting ad that they cropped for the cover, Officer, Nurse, Woman. And it kind of brings together all of these ideas that I really found interesting. And so what really drew me to this topic is that, you know, the Vietnam War is such a complex time in American history. The war itself was controversial and very divisive. There are a lot of social and cultural changes going on in the 60s, particularly for women who form most of the nurse corps at this time. And so I was really interested in, you know, what is it like for the Army to have to recruit 5,000 nurses really, really quickly for the Vietnam War in the midst of this era, right? How are you going to reach out to them, right? Are you going to go with these kind of conventional patriotic calls? Are you going to offer adventure? Like, what are you going to do to offer, to recruit nurses? And so there are all of these changes, and that was what I was interested in. Like, how does the Army deal with women in the midst of the women's revolution, the sexual liberation, this controversial war? Like, how is all of that going to come together? And how is this going to look in the middle of the war? And so this kind of brings it all together. This ad actually ran in Glamour and Mademoiselle in 1969. They were really trying hard to recruit nurses. And so we'll look at sort of the experience of being an officer, right, being in the military. What is that like in the middle of this war? What motivates nurses to join? What do they think of their duties in the middle of all of this? And then what is it like to be a nurse? Right? Nursing itself is changing pretty rapidly in the late 60s, early 70s. So what is it like to be a nurse at a time when educational standards are changing? You've got sort of this odd mix of people pushing a bachelor's degree at the same time that many nurses are told to stand up when the physician walks in the room. Right? It's just an odd combination of things going on in the time. But also military medicine is changing really rapidly. Right? You're bringing in wounded 20 minutes after they've been wounded in the field. What is that like for most of these nurses who are pretty fresh out of nursing school, right? You've just graduated, here you go, here's your introduction to nursing. And then as women, sort of the last part of that, like what is it like to be a woman in the military at this time? But more specifically, what I'm interested in is gender. So most people outside this room probably don't realize that about 25 to 30% of the Army nurses in Vietnam were men. The Vietnam War is the first time men were in the Army Nurse Corps. And so if I say that to people outside this room, they're in total shock. They don't, it's like, wow, you just told me the sky is purple. But what is that like, right? What is that transition like, especially for the men who were nurses, to move into the Army at a time when most of sort of the leadership in the Army still has these very conventional ideas that nurses are supposed to wear. They're supposed to look like her, but be in a white uniform, right? A cute little skirt uniform, hat. They're supposed to look like that. So what is it like? What does it mean for all of the men who come into nursing at that time? So we'll bring all of this together, and we'll start with a few recruiting ads because I love recruiting ads. This is my all-time favorite recruiting ad from World War II. Right, save his life and find your own. These very heroically wounded, handsome young men, nurses just wipe fevered brows and find husbands. Right, that was basically the pitch in World War II. Right, everybody's always very, very perfectly made up. Their hair is ideal, and they're wearing makeup, and the men are always handsome, and everybody's in white. There's no blood anywhere in these ads. But this is probably not going to recruit a whole lot of women in the 1960s, right? This kind of approach. A straight up kind of patriotic appeal might not work in the 1960s either, right? Where you have, again, a World War II ad, you've sort of got Uncle Sam putting her cap on her, right? That might work for some, but it's probably not going to work for everybody. And so what you get in the 60s is this mix of sort of appeal tactics. And I love this one. Be the nurse you were meant to be. It's sort of the modern day Florence Nightingale, right? She's in the tent, but she's now got a flashlight instead of her lamp, right? So it's a very conventional kind of picture. It says you're needed for your skills and your training, your pride, your dedication to your profession, right? All of those words were kind of progressive for nursing at the time, right? A profession, your dedication, your skills. But if you keep reading, it says you're needed too for your woman's touch, your cheerfulness, your reassuring smile in the middle of a long night, right? Like, what kind of marketing person put these two things together, right? Right? You're very skillful, but you're also comforting. And so the mix of the two, I guess, is what's gonna make all of these people well. Here's another ad. Let the Army bring out the specialist in you. This is a more progressive kind of ad for the time period because the Army really pushed specialization and advanced education for nurses in a way that civilian nursing did not. So they were pushing the BSN at a time when a lot of schools were not. A lot of, civilian nursing was still mostly coming through diploma schools. The Army was, by the end of the war, requiring a BSN, which was very advanced. They were also pushing advanced training, OR training, all kinds of specialized nursing care. It's sort of very advanced. This also suggests sort of advancement, that women would be in charge of men in particular. So that you can't read the text at the top, but it's essentially a story about this nurse who is training corpsmen, right? And there's a lot of sort of implication that she's the one in charge, right? She outranks them. She's the one teaching the class, right? It's very kind of advanced for the time. And at the same time, you have ads like this, the most beautiful girl in the world, right, who, again, makes men well because she's pretty, not because she's skilled or is capable of any sort of medical care. It's basically that, they look up and they see her, and she's pretty, right? So it's, again, the mix of things. It's sort of the, like, throw spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks kind of approach, right? We're just going to try everything, right? We're going to see what happens. This one is a really good blending of the two approaches. Right, on and off duty. Army nurses have a better life. No, maybe they do. They might, I don't know. I've never been an Army nurse, so I can't vouch for that. But right, so you've got the images sort of juxtaposed side by side. The text suggests the same thing, right? You're a professional, we recognize your dedication, your skill, but you might also meet your spouse. All right, so again, a little bit of everything. Now, nurses don't frequently join because they saw a recruiting ad, maybe they do, but nurses' motivations are always as individual as each person. And so it's hard to take a group of 5,000 Army nurses and say, here's why they joined. But by and large, most nurses, most women in particular, joined because they needed to pay for their education, right? They all came through the Army Student Nurse Corps or Student Nurse Program. Right, so in the years before Army nursing was part of ROTC programs like it is now, it was a separate Army Student Nurse Program. And so it paid for your education in exchange for however many years of service. That's how most nurses came in. But why did they become nurses? For a lot of women, I can't tell you the number of women who said, well, I had three choices. I could be a nurse, a teacher, or secretary. See, I was right. Right? They said they felt like they could be one of three things. And so nursing seemed the best option. Right? Now, some women said, I grew up, I was Florence Nightingale for Halloween, and I, had my little medical kit, and I always wanted to be a nurse. Other women said, I wanted to actually be a physician, and I went down that path and quickly realized that that wasn't what women did. In various ways, I was sort of encouraged to go back over here to nursing. So you see kind of a mix of motivations. I found what really surprised me, what I found really interesting was that a lot of women went to nursing and joined the Army, which in many ways could be seen as sort of conventional, become a nurse, do this kind of traditional women's job, but they did it as a way to escape a conventional life, right? So Kate O'Hare Palmer, who is this woman here at her first post at the Second Surge in Lake Hay. Incidentally, this is Kate back here. Here we go. That's Kate, which I didn't realize until Kate read an article that I wrote that had recruitment ads printed in it. And she read it and she looked through it and she said, that's me. And she sent me an email. I had no idea, but now that you mention it, it kind of does look like you. But this is Kate. She grew up in Southern California. And her brother had served in Vietnam, and he always sent back pictures of his unit, and he was in a hospital. I think he got malaria at one point, and he was in a hospital, and so he kept writing to Kate. And while she was in nursing school, she said it sounded fun, like it seemed like a good time. And so she wanted to get out of California. I find it weird that many people try their whole lives to get to Southern California, and Kate wanted out of Southern California. But she said that, you know, lots of people her age, all of her friends were getting married, and she said, I didn't want to get married immediately. So she joined the Army Nurse Corps program, she went to nursing school, and she really said that what she wanted to do was to go to somewhere like Okinawa. Like, it's close to Vietnam, but it's not Vietnam, right? She felt like that would be the ideal place. Like, I could help. I'd be close. I might be treating the wounded who've been evacuated out of Vietnam. But she became an operating room nurse, which in hindsight was the last thing she should have done if she wanted to avoid an assignment to Vietnam. And so she got her first orders out of her training at Letterman, and of course they're to Vietnam, and she very politely goes to the chief nurse and says, I think there's a mistake. I don't want to go to Vietnam. And that didn't go over well. The chief nurse says, look, you're in the Army now. And so off she went, first to Like, and there she goes. But a lot of women were like Kate. You know, they said, I didn't want to get married. Remember, this is a time when women typically got married very young. Said, I didn't want to do that. A lot of women wanted to be financially independent, right? And so this is the way to do that. You start your career, you're in the Army, you can travel, right? You're going to travel whether you like it or not sometimes. So you get reassigned, you could have this independent life, have your own finances. It seemed a very independent kind of thing to do, even as they were doing something that most people would have seen as sort of conventionally, a woman's job. Right? So sort of using the convention as a way to do something unconventional. Now most men, including my new friend Jim back here, joined the Army Nurse Corps because they were drafted, right? The military is pretty smart about that. Like, hey, if there are men out there who are nurses, we can issue a special draft for nurses, and they literally got every single man in the country who was a nurse. It doesn't mean he served in Vietnam, but it meant that he had served in the military, right? So he might have served earlier in the late 50s, early 60s before they start sending nurses to Vietnam, but all men who were nurses at that time served in the military, right? So there wasn't much motivation except for this draft notice there, perhaps. Now, a lot of nurses joined specifically so they could go to Vietnam, right? One nurse called this the Florence Nightingale syndrome, right? I'm a nurse, there's a war, I need to go, right? It was as simple as that. One woman, Judy Hartline Elbring, sometimes I do this with people who, I'm always like, somebody's going to know somebody who I'm mentioning here. But she actually did more than volunteer to go to Vietnam. She wanted to go to Vietnam so badly, she figured out that if she became a nurse, that would be the way to go. So she became a nurse specifically so she could go to Vietnam. Her father, she said she'd grown up hearing her father's stories of World War II, and she thought that was what you were supposed to do. If there's a war, you go. And so she became a nurse specifically so she could go to Vietnam. Other women, I found this really interesting, actually opposed the war and had participated in anti-war moratoriums or marches or demonstrations, but said, my nursing trumps my politics, and so I'm going to go. Betsy Leach had participated in a march at the White House a couple years before, which they went to the White House and read all of the names of Americans who had been killed in Vietnam. And she'd participated in that. And then she volunteered to go to Vietnam because she says, I realized that those men didn't have a choice. And so she opposed the war but still went. And so I thought that was a really interesting kind of mix of political thoughts, kind of going on in her head. And another thing that I thought really interesting was that a lot of women thought that it was their duty as citizens, right? So men were drafted, women were not. Women still do not register for selective service, men do. And these women in the 1960s and early 70s said, it didn't matter that I was a woman, I thought that I had a duty as a citizen to serve. And they said that in light of the fact that men their age were drafted. Sorry, so Lily Adams, she said, I felt very guilty that the guys had to deal with these decisions and that girls didn't. And so she became an Army nurse and went to Vietnam. Right? That's a pretty progressive kind of thing, especially when a time when women were not expected to serve and women serving in the military was not common by any stretch of the imagination, right? But however they get to Vietnam, nursing is completely different than what they had been familiar with and what they might have expected. And so for most nurses, you know, ideally the Army didn't want to just send you straight to Vietnam. Ideally you would have had about 6 months training, or sort of not training, but kind of experience in a stateside hospital before you went to Vietnam. But depending on your specialization and depending on needs in country, people were sent sometimes earlier than might have been ideal. And so Jennifer Lundberg here at the 3rd Surge in Binh Thuy, she says she was 21 years old and she was on night duty once and she was in charge of the ward, and she says she realized that she was in charge of the ward and 21 years old, and it seemed pretty shocking. She's like, I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to do with this now, but I'm really young and in charge of things. Right, and remember this is a time when a lot of nurses are standing up when physicians walk in the room, right? And so a lot of nursing education was pretty conventional. All of a sudden you're in Vietnam, 21 years old and in charge of your ward, right? Welcome to nursing, right? But it's not that nurses didn't like that, right? A lot of them saw this as sort of the height of their nursing career. This is a time when I welcome the challenge. These are new responsibilities. You know, it was a profound challenge, but one that most nurses welcomed. So an operating nurse, this is Kate here at the 2nd Surge, but another operating nurse at the 12th evac said, I learned quickly that I had to be both nurse and surgeon. On full body wounds, the surgeon would assign me part of the body and we did the same job. Right? And I think OR nurses really had that experience more than anybody else, especially in situations where you have a lot of casualties coming in. The Tet Offensive in early '68 really presented this kind of situation where you've got lots and lots of people and you're trying to move through surgeries as quickly as possible. Nurses are closing up. Nurses are doing things that no civilian nurse in America would have been doing. Right? And for a lot of those nurses, that was a really welcome challenge. Right? It was a challenge, but they really liked that. They welcomed that challenge. Another nurse, Jean Riviera, she said, I felt empowered. She said, I wasn't a subservient individual, and that's how nurses were generally perceived at the time. But she said that when she was in nursing in Vietnam, she said that it gave me a sense of accomplishment. I actually had the power to do what I wanted to do. In the States, you didn't have that, but in Vietnam, it seemed people didn't question what I wanted to do. And so for a lot of nurses, especially those who came back and went into civilian nursing, they realized pretty quickly that nursing in Vietnam was sort of the height of their professional practice. Almost every single nurse I interviewed who went back into civilian nursing had a story of going to the hospital on the first day and being told, well, we have to supervise you for however many number of times to put in an IV. Right, and these nurses are like, I've just put in thousands of IVs, right? Like, that's what I did every day, all day long, right? And so that kind of return to, right, you're beneath the physician, you know, we need to watch you, make sure you're okay at your job, that did not go over well. And a lot of nurses quickly then got out of civilian nursing and went back into the Army. Or in many other cases went back into like working at a VA, right? They wanted to be sort of around that kind of medical care. One nurse, I thought this was really funny, she said when she went back to her civilian nursing that it was dreadfully archaic and belittling. And she said, I had to learn to shut up and be a good little obedient handmaiden to the doctors. That was not what she wanted, right? Not after this experience in Vietnam where a lot of them said, I felt very equal to physicians, which is not something they would have said in a civilian hospital. But on the other hand, the big challenge for a lot of nursing is that nursing in wartime makes you face the cost of war, right? Wartime nursing, the story of wartime nursing does not involve charges up San Juan Hill, right? It's not John Wayne, like, charging into battle and everybody's, it's glamorous and, hoorah or whatever. I always get the Army and the Marines mixed up, and somebody will call me out on that. But it's not this, like, heroic, exciting battle. Nursing in war means you look every single day, all day long, at the cost of war. And that was, if you've got the professional challenge on one hand that you embrace, looking at the cost of war on the other hand is very troubling, right? And so a lot of nurses talked about that, right? Especially nurses who had to do triage, right? Or nurses who are working in surgeries. But I think it's something that every nurse faced. So Mary Reynolds Powell, she actually wrote a really good book I've used in class with students before. When she went to Vietnam, she fully supported the war effort. But she said by the time she left, she actually opposed the war, and it was because of the nursing that she did. She said that, she talks about sort of, as a nurse, your job is to make people better. But in the Army, what's the motto of the Army Medical Department? Conserve the fighting strength, right? That's not necessarily make people better so they go home and have a good time. It's make people better so they can go back to battle, right? That's a little different. And I like this picture here. It's nurses, they're not in uniform, but they're kind of waving the men off, right? They've just made them better. The men are now able to leave the hospital, and they're going straight back at it. And that was really hard for nurses, right? I mean, imagine being 22 years old, straight out of nursing school, bam, you're in Vietnam, and this is what you have to deal with and try to reconcile your political thoughts of the war with your mission to send people back to it, right? And so that was really hard for a lot of nurses. Mary said that sending soldiers back to danger ran counter to the heart and soul of nursing. It was the most difficult thing we were called on to do, yet we did it, and we never talked about it or its effect on us. So for a lot of nurses, what I found is that they just internalized it, right? You don't have the satisfaction of knowing what happens to the patient when you make them better, right? They're just gone. And that was very difficult and led to a lot of nurses just kind of internalizing that, not thinking about it, and having emotional trauma themselves because of all of the work that they're called on to do. For some, they kind of blend the work and the politics. I think this is a funny picture of Janice making the peace sign. I wish I had a picture of it, but Kate Palmer, who I've talked about, she actually, when she went into to the OR, she had sterilized a peace button. She sterilized, you have to make sure it's sterile so it can go into the OR, but she sterilized it and she carried it into the OR on her tray of all of her instruments, right? Now that doesn't do anything to, to challenge the war effort. It doesn't do anything, but it makes her feel better, right? It makes her feel like, I would like some peace out of all of this. And you see nurses trying to kind of bring their political thoughts together with the war and really try to figure that out. And again, remember, for most of them, they're really, really young, right? And so every day, I think about this with college students now. I used to think that 24 was, an adult and old. And I would teach college students, and I look at them sometimes, I'm like, wow, like, and years ago, like, we would have sent you guys to war. I'm like, you're not ready for that. So imagine you're really young and you're dealing with all of this at the same time. And that was really, really hard for a lot of people. Nursing also introduces you to the civilian casualties of war in a way that a lot of people don't see. Right, so here's Jennifer Lundberg again. A lot of these nurses would go on the med caps and work in orphanages or go out and do sort of preventive, polio shots and all sorts of things. Jennifer and a bunch of the nurses worked in an orphanage, and she said that dealing with children who had been wounded in war was profoundly difficult, right? And so then it makes them question all of it, right? And you've got to sort of figure out what you think of all of that. Right, so nurses, however they got to the war, end up seeing the cost of war more than most people, more than any other Americans in country, I think, right? You might have seen a lot, but if you're in the hospital, you're seeing that every day. And so however they got there, whatever they thought of their nursing practice, however much they enjoyed that, it was still a profound kind of emotional thing to deal with on a daily basis. But at the same time, the Army is sort of dealing, again, kind of going back to this idea of women, it's dealing with what they think of women in the Army at this time period. What is that about? And then what do we think of men and women as nurses? And so from the beginnings of the Nurse Corps, I feel like I should be giving guys quizzes. The beginnings of the Nurse Corps in 1900, there we go. From the very beginnings, nurses had sort of served with what was called relative rank, which really meant basically not much. But after World War II, they'd been pushing for actual rank, and that had had some success. But by the Vietnam era, there's still a push to sort of open all ranks to women, to allow married women to serve in the regular Army, to allow mothers to serve in the regular Army. And in 1967, the Army lifted all restrictions on ranks that women could achieve. So at that point, the chief of the Corps was a colonel, but by 1967, they'd said, okay, women can now be generals. And in June 1970, General Westmoreland promoted the chief of the Army Nurse Corps, Anna Mae Hayes, to the rank of Brigadier General, and she's the first woman general in the United States. Now, there were 2 women promoted that day. The Women's Army Corps is always like, we had the first women general. No. Anna Mae Hayes was actually a couple minutes before, so she's technically the first. Right, and they did that actually because the Army Nurse Corps was older than the Women's Army Corps, and so they promoted General Hayes first. But the Army Nurse Corps had the first woman general. Yeah. And Anna Mae Hayes is sort of your poster child for the ideal kind of person to do that. But the Army was still kind of figuring out what they thought about all that, right? So I'm going to play you a short little video clip from her promotion ceremony. So Westmoreland's back from Vietnam. He's chief of staff of the Army at this point. And he frequently sticks his foot in his mouth.
I hereby establish a new protocol for congratulating Lady General.
All right, nobody's calling them men generals. And he kisses her. I mean, like, let that sink in for a minute, right? Like, imagine that happening today. Right? So on the one hand, right, promoting General Hayes is a profound change that you can't take back, right? That brass ceiling is open forevermore, right? And it keeps expanding, right? At this time, she's a brigadier general. The chief of the Corps is now what, a major general, right? Things move forward from here, right? But Westmoreland, at least, is still having a hard time figuring out what to do with lady generals, right? And if you read the newspaper articles about her promotion, on one hand, they recognize, right, here is this very accomplished World War II nurse. She was in Korea. She's done X, Y, and Z. She's done all these things. But does she clean her own house? And does she cook her own dinner? And what size clothes does she wear? Not just what clothes does she wear, but what size are they? Right, so there's a lot of, like, we're not quite sure what we think of all this right now, right? And it's just a really interesting moment to me to think about, you know, how the Army is sort of dealing with all of these changes, right? On one hand, we're going to have change, but we're going to take our time, you know, catching up to that change and realizing what it means. The same thing with men. Since the founding of the Nurse Corps in 1901, men had not been able to be nurses. It doesn't mean there weren't men who were nurses who served in the military, but they weren't in the Nurse Corps. And all of that had to do with the Army and with the medical profession at large, and the American public thinking that nursing was supposed to be a woman's job. right? And so in 1955, the Army Nurse Corps let men into the reserves, and by 1966 into the regular Army, and that's because of the Vietnam War, right? We need nurses, so we're going to have to change, right? But a lot of folks in the upper echelons of the Army really resisted the change, right? So if this is Westmoreland reacting to the lady general, you can imagine the things that were said about some of the first male nurses, right? And the suspicions that were held about men who would want to be nurses. Mildred Clark, who was chief in '66 when the change was instated, she said that all of these old Army men kept telling her that they wanted these attractive nurses to take care of them. I don't want somebody who shaves his face to take care of me. You know, and I always read that and I'm like, well, tell them to lay there and be sick then, whatever. You know, but that wasn't the response at the time. You know, but they really kind of weren't sure what to make of it, and there were all of these suspicions and sort of whispered rumors about these men. And so the first men who came in to the Army Nurse Corps, I think, really broke their own glass ceiling, right? Broke their own barriers to say, hey, nursing is nursing is nursing, right? And so there were a lot of changes that were going on at the time. And the Army Nurse Corps was always very good to say nurses are nurses, and we don't make distinctions. But that was what they said, and the reality was a little more complicated. When nurses went to Brooke Army Medical Center for their sort of initial introduction to the Army, women got a total of 3 hours of introduction to weapons, like 1, 2, 3, and probably you didn't touch it. You just watched some guy out there on the football field. Look at it. Here it is. And but men spent an additional 16 hours, which is still not a lot, but 16 hours, learning to fire the weapon, maneuver under simulated combat situations, right? The men, right, we're going to send men, they might need to use weapons. Women, no. They actually spent those extra 13 hours learning how to properly wear their uniforms. That's what they did with the extra 13 hours when the men were out learning about weapons. And the uniform actually is a really interesting sort of study in itself. So most nurses in Vietnam wore fatigues, right? The 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon was supposed to look very stateside, and so they wore whites, but the vast majority of nurses wore fatigues, though some knucklehead was always suggesting we want everybody in white, right? Despite the fact of how impractical it was, that the water made they all turned orange. They weren't white because of the water, they rusted in the water. Like, it wasn't a good idea for anybody to be in white, but somebody would always say, we really want nurses in white uniforms. And they always said, when they made this suggestion, they always said, we want women in white uniforms. They look better, they're good for patient morale, they're good for the physician's morale, if they look cute, but no men need to be wearing white, put them in fatigues. Right, they always made that distinction, right? Men in fatigues, we don't want them boosting anybody's morale, right? I don't know, maybe the female nurses would be like, no, put them in white, they look better, it makes me happy. I don't know, nobody cared about the women's morale, right? We just want the men to not look like nurses. We want them to look like Army men, right? And so it's just a really interesting situation. Here we go. Here's Terry Krantz at the 93rd Evac. But whatever they're wearing, even in fatigues, nurses, if they are women, are very visible in Vietnam simply because of the numbers, right? They stand out. And on a good day, you might get people taking your picture. You might get cat calls. You might get people whistling, and that's a good day, right? On the first couple days, and again, remember, for most of these women who are 22, 23, that might be fun for a couple days. And then it gets old really fast, right? And so I find that really interesting are these women in particular who are sort of expected to be there to comfort and to assure and are treating men who are their age or younger, right? You're still young. They like to go on dates, most of them, right? You know, they're still young and they would like to be young people, but at the same time they're being sort of pressured and told, also you need to put that dress on that we told you to bring to Vietnam. Put that on and go because you're going to the commanding general's tent or not tent, probably, he didn't have a tent, a trailer, and you're going to have dinner, and you're going to be there for the party, right? And that might seem good because you actually get a steak and some real silverware, and, you get a nice meal, but you're there to entertain, and you're there to look pretty, and that gets old fast too, right? And so a lot of women that I talked to talked about this frustration of wanting nothing more at the end of the day but to decompress. Come off the ward, just go back to the hooch and just veg out, right? Rose Sandecki said that after work, what she really wanted to do was just go to the officers club, have a drink, and just relax. But if she went to the officers club, she couldn't do that because, man after man after man after man is coming in asking her to dance, wanting to sit beside her, hitting on her, how you doing? Like over and over and over and over. So if she avoided that and just went back to her hooch, then people would say, oh, why is she not coming out? Maybe she's dating somebody. Maybe she's dating this guy. Maybe she's a lesbian. Like, who knows? The rumors were just all over the place, right? And so she really talked about how frustrating that was, that she could never just find time by herself because of all of these expectations, right? And I don't think that has ever gone away. I think that's always been and probably always will be. But what I found interesting about that, too, is that the leadership of the Nurse Corps recognized that, and they frequently noted in the chief nurse's end-of-the-year report would frequently note that women weren't afraid of the war, they were afraid of American GIs. And they were very plain about that. And so I thought that, they're recognizing this at the top levels. They know that. Kate Palmer, who I've mentioned several times, I thought her choice of words was really interesting. She said you had to learn to maneuver to protect yourself. So she's using that military word, maneuver, to learn how to figure things out. But our most lasting image of nurses in the war is the Vietnam Women's Memorial. And I am really proud of this. Lenny served on the advisory board for a very long time. I came in at the very end, but Lenny was there for a long time. And I think the memorial brings together all of these themes as well. It is a radical presence on the mall, right? If you go to the National Mall in DC, there is one memorial to women, and it's that one, right? People often mention WMSA. It's not on the mall. It's a separate place. Legislatively, that's a different process. There's one memorial on our mall to women, and it's this one. Again, you can't go back from there, right? That is a profound change. Decades of work, lobbying Congress, getting veterans organizations behind you, getting 2 presidents to sign off on bills. It was a long, long, long process. In its design, it's a little more complicated. Like with our students, I take them back to their art history class. This is the Pietà, basically. It's sort of the picture of the fallen Christ figure being held by the women. Right? In its design, it's pretty conventional, particularly the figures in the front. Now, the women on the side and the woman in the back are less conventional, but there's some sort of conventional understandings of at least what nurses do in that memorial. And what I find most fascinating about this is sort of the ways in which Diane Evans, who was an Army nurse at the 71st in Pleiku, and then she was down in Vung Ta at the 36th, she kind of led this memorial effort. And early on, they knew that they had to get the veterans organizations behind them. Right? Because if you go to Congress and you're trying to get all of these bills passed and you don't have the American Legion and the VFW, it's just not going to work, right? And so she went to the VFW and she stood before the entire convention, and they're about to have this vote on whether or not they're going to support the women's effort. And so Diane stands up and she makes this long speech about all the ways that American women served in Vietnam. They're Army nurses, they're Navy nurses, they're Air Force nurses, they're donut dollies, they're in special services, they're civilian nurses, they're working in the WACs, they're long list. Here's what they did, here's what they accomplished, here are all of the ways they participated in the war. And the VFW voted, and they said, no, we don't support that memorial. Well, she knew somebody who got her on the program again the next day. And the next day she went and she said, I took no notes. I didn't practice a speech. She said, I stood on stage and I said, when I was in Vietnam, some man's son died in my arms. and they voted, and guess what they voted? We support that memorial. What worked for them was not what women did, it was what they represented, right? And I find that really interesting, right? They didn't support all of the accomplishments, all of the ways they had broken the brass ceiling and, all of those things. What worked was the most conventional understanding of what women do in war, and that's holding dying boys, right? And so even in our lasting image, we're still bringing together all of these really complicated and sometimes conflicting ideas of what nurses were and what women are and all of that, right? And so it's just been a really interesting project.
A wonderful presentation, and kudos to our committee that brought in the speakers, and we've had a great group of speakers to now. We don't usually have folks that are not nurses, and this has brought in a tremendous perspective on something that you can tell is very near and dear to the hearts of folks out here, because you're looking at people that served and really held those patients in their arms. So we appreciate what you did. We appreciate you coming here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to give you the Army Nurse Corps coin.
Thank you.
You know how to use it.